There you go.
Well, good afternoon. It's a minute after the noon hour, and welcome to our live broadcast for History 282, World War II. I believe you all can hear me and you can see my screen. Today, our two goals updates and your questions, and then the content presentation is going to be Stalingrad and Moscow, the Battle of both Stalingrad and Moscow. All right, so let's do a little bit on our updates as we kind of launch forward here. This is week 10. I hope you all had a great spring break and had a chance to get away from your computers and your computer screens. And now we're back at it. And so in week 10, it's called the Eastern Front. And today you're going to see what's happening in at Stalingrad and Moscow. All right. What I have for you in week 10 is reading out of the Gilbert book. There's a BBC podcast that's very good for you to listen to. And then there's that C SPAN program that deals with the Battle of Moscow. All the three areas, the readings, the podcast, and the media are just exceptional. So it's important that you look at all of them and read Gilbert. Week 10 is exam week, so yesterday I opened up the link so you can find it. The You'll have from yesterday until Saturday at 11:59 to enter the three exam questions, and there are three very distinct, separate questions that you've selected, and you need to then respond to those three questions. Upload them on Saturday, no later than 11:59 at the end of the day, and then I'll start working on them. All right. Okay. That's important, and you would have selected them from the questions. I opened them up on Wednesday, March 24th, so you've had one entire week. And if you don't submit them until this Saturday, then you've had 10 days to prepare for those three questions. All right. Now, the key is as we're winding down on these reflections, and the last reflection is also due this week, and I'm asking everyone to follow the guidelines as we um, kind of wind down the reflections, and there's only 10 of them. Last semester, most of the folks kept doing them when I told them they didn't have to, but they liked them, and I read them, and it was wonderful. But you don't have to do those. What you need to do is move the focus now to the paper that you're working on. You got to keep reading the textbook. You got to engage the module. And now you've got the remaining time you have to work with your research paper because that's not a sleeper anymore. That's on the horizon. And you need to meet the page allocations that are there. And I'll review those a little bit because and we want that at the same level that individuals have been performing in the reflections and also with the first examination. Now you need to submit the drafts according to the timeline. And what I'll do is kind of look at them and give you a little pass on those as to how you're doing. That gets you to actually do something and turn it in so I know that there's something there. Then what you do is you spend the next 6 weeks, this is week 10, getting that paper, those responses to those questions up to the level that they need to be so that you get a good mark for those. And that means there's page allocations, there's research to do, and it's research in .gov, .org, and um, uh, org, .gov, .edu. Those are the three that you're going to have to look at. You can also look at the National Archives. You can look at all of the archival resources that are out there. You can look at memorials for the United States Navy. You can They have records if you're dealing with the submarines and the Army Air Corps, the Air Force if you're dealing with B-17 bombers, and if you're dealing with letters, if you've picked a letter from a World War II soldier. You can also look for family websites and individuals that have all of those taken care of. So you need to submit the drafts according to the timetable. And then the next 6 weeks, you need to continue to pay attention to your questions. You need to do further research. All right. In the letters on page 4 of the syllabus, it lists the number of pages that you need for each question. All right. Now, for B-17, those papers, a minimum of one page per question on the B-17s. Then we need to deal with the submarines. Uh, those, a minimum, if you look at the questions, are all loaded into the assignments that I have. The submarines, also a minimum of 1 page. And those are double spaced. So you've got to really hone in and go through those questions and make sure that you've listed what you needed to do if you're identifying the specifications of a B 17. So it has to be just not a bunch of facts out there. You need to read through it and make sure that it's very readable as I go through these papers. All right. Now, if you need help, you can go to the databases that are in the library. Um, there's JSTOR, there's ProQuest that's there, and there's also the History Center. So you can start doing that. So, like on the submarines, what class submarine? Look at the questions, and it's just not hurry up and find a whole bunch of things on the internet and put them up there. No, you gotta go through those, and on those submarine reports, I've given you the link to the original reports that you can see from the National Archives. And when I said summarize them, I had somebody saying, like, wow, there's like 40 or 50 of them. I told you that you summarize it by looking through those reports and seeing how they're written. Do they all start the same? What do they cover in their reports? Because they have a system, where the submarine is, what the weather is, what supplies they've taken on. So you kind of tell me, we've got 40 or 50 of these reports and they all kind of cover the same thing. And then there's a lot of action here because they get involved in shooting, trying to sink other ships, running convoys, support systems, food resources off the islands. There's a lot of things in there. So you don't have to take each one of the reports and summarize them. You have to look at all of them and say, okay, what are the key components in here? Because it's an important part. I don't want folks dropping off on these. So you've got 6 weeks to focus on your research. Use the right websites like that. Look up Naval Institute, look up Naval Memorials, look up Air Memorials, all of those kinds of things. And so you know where to go for. You start with the Harper databases. You're still having trouble, you can email a librarian and ask for help. You can also contact your own local library as to if you're looking for some documents, something about the U.S. Census, right? Or you can contact me and I can help you as well. Now, the due dates tomorrow is April 2nd. Question 6 is due, right? And if you look on the syllabus, you can see on page 8, that's the timetable. So when folks email me and saying, gee, they're confused, I said, oh, how are we confused? Well, when do they do? I said, did you check the syllabus? The what? Right. Okay. So you see where we are. You got the tools in front of you. You open up the toolbox and you take the hammer out. Where's the hammer? It's in the toolbox. Where's the toolbox? Well, it's right online here. Take a look at that. All right. So I also have links set up so you can submit the questions, and those are just a way to determine that you're working, you're finding some things, and then by the time week 14 comes along, you've got to have those questions put together and you proofread them, get some good content. You send me an email, a draft. I'll take a look at it, and then give you the my views as to what needs to be done, and then you'll have a week or a little more than a week to make the corrections in week 15, because then you'll turn everything in on week 16. And week 16 ends with May 21st. That's a Friday. So you get the exam questions the Wednesday of week 15, and then on week 16, um, in the that Wednesday, you have Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday to turn in the three essay questions that you have, and then to turn in your research paper that you have. And the reason why we do that is because at 11:59 on May 21st, they turn Blackboard off, and for me to get it back on is going to would take a while. So then on Saturday and Sunday, I've got to grade everything and turn the grades in on Monday morning. That's how it works, like that. Okay. So that's kind of the direction that we've got moving at this time. All right. What questions, comments do you have? I'll turn it over to you. Um, Anything you want to ask, and then I'll give you the takeaway for today and get started.
When we do the individual, submissions for the research and stuff, um,
Hmm.
does that necessarily need to be all tied into that narrative body. Obviously, it will be by what we submit to you for week 14 when you look at it all. But like right now,
No, no,
okay,
it's
there
the
could be some
questions, and
bullet points and stuff.
oh, absolutely. You just
Okay,
turn in the
awesome.
response to the question. That's the data that I look at to see that you're getting some good things. Now, even when you turn the paper in, you have an option. You can do a narrative, or you can just turn in the questions retooled to look a lot better than when I first got them. What I'm
Oh,
looking for is that
okay. So it doesn't all need to be
you're
tied
doing them.
into that narrative body yet and stuff. Then.
No,
Okay,
no,
awesome. Thank you.
no. Yeah. Then the last page is your selected bibliography, which we've talked about, and
Hmm.
some folks from last semester found that out. I mean, I mention it every time. They said, "Well, what happened?" I said, "Well, where's your selected bibliography?" And they said, "What?" And I said, "Okay, when you figure it out, you can email me back." That is a real important part of that paper. It's a selected bibliography, 2 words, and it's in the um, research materials. You look under the Trabian and it'll say the Trabian tip sheet. That's a selected bibliography. Please don't call it resources, works cited, what I looked at, whatever all those others. This is an academic paper. We're not dealing with single A activity. We're in the pros here. So an academic paper has a selected bibliography, not something references, works cited. When I see that, it takes the air out of my sails, and I don't want to get stalled in the Black Sea. Oh, it's wonderful there. I'd rather get out into the Mediterranean. So you've got to look at that. These are the components, and this is what I'm going over every week. So you have to look at that tip sheet that's there, and it shows you how to do a bibliography. You just copy exactly what's there with what resources you've looked at. You can use what I've covered in the Collaborate. You can use anything in our modules. You can learn. You put things you found online. You got from the library, that you got from the National Archives, whatever family websites that talked about the soldier. Those are permissible, but we don't want a lot of .com sites. A lot of that is just not erroneous. This is some good research you're doing with a letter that probably no one's ever written anything about the letter that you've selected. Those B-17s are out there, and there's all these bits and pieces floating on the internet about them, but you're actually putting them together. And the key is, if you're doing a B-17, which B-17 do they have? Students said, "Well, what do you mean?" I said, "Okay, you got to do a little more reading. I mean, well, what model B-17 are we talking about?" Oh, they're different models. I just thought, oh, submarines. Oh, yeah, they're all submarines were the same. Really? That's news. What class submarine do you have? I gave you a specific class of submarines to look at, and rare to find one book just dealing with one submarine. Last couple of weeks I had some folks wanting to find. They couldn't even. It took them a while, but they finally found the captains of the submarines, and they thought, "Gee, it's terrible. Wouldn't you think that our government would know who all those captains were, those submarines?" Yeah, I would think so. A lot of them died on those submarines too. Well, don't you think we should know about what they were doing out there in the Pacific? Big part of the war. Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. I wish I had more time to deal with them, but that's the war in the Pacific. So I think you'll be fine. All right, what else do you have before I move on? Questions, comments, anything I can help you with?
I'm good. I showed the
Okay.
Turabian tip sheet on the recording for everyone watching.
Yeah, good, good. Okay, today then, Stalingrad and Moscow, if I can put it all together for us. And the takeaway, and if you attend the sessions, these will be exam questions. And if I don't get them on the final exam and you write them down now, you can write them right on them. And one is the significance of Stalingrad and Moscow. And the significance is that this is really, for many, the turning point of the war. It's not so much Stalingrad anymore; it's the Battle of Moscow. Um, that's the big one, the Battle of Moscow and the Battle of Stalingrad. And I spent a lot of time. Even this last week, I've been working on Stalingrad for us. So what I want to do is just give you a brief intro, and then I'm going to move into the slides that I have. Um, Stalingrad is the city that defeated the Third Reich. It ended on February 2nd, 1943. The death toll was over 2 million. Yeah, that's right. 2 million that we know of. hmm The Germans called it the Second Verdun. The Russians called it the Red Verdun. There's no fortresses, no concrete shelters. Battle lasted 6 months. Okay. And if you were in Britain, um, occupied France, North Africa, Egypt, any of those, when the news came on about the war, the only thing you wanted to listen to for 6 months is Stalingrad. Because we really don't have any real strong Allied victories prior to Stalingrad. Yeah. And the Germans end up getting over 300,000 troops in what is called the Kessel, Kessel pocket at Stalingrad. What Stalingrad is, it's called the time of reckoning. And what it did is, what the Russians did here is they disrupted the Nazi death machine, is what they did. And not until it's over did the Russians or the Soviets let correspondence come into the city, which was entirely destroyed. The battle is one of men over metal, Soviet men over German metal. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, that's what's going on. And what I've had the opportunity is that in January of 1943, the day before the Russians really begin the offensive, uh, they let in a series of historians, their own, to interview eyewitness accounts of civilians, officers, commissars, all of that. Because even the Russian high command, which was not near the city, they were on the outside of the city, a good distance away, didn't understand how those people at Stalingrad overcame the German army. And I'll tell you, before I get into the slides, I'll tell you a little bit because I was intrigued for years until I started reading these um, as to what happened. And those were all in Russian. And finally, after Gorbachev, there was sometimes out before that, they actually put all these together and figured out what was happening in Stalingrad. How did it happen? What did they do? Okay. What it is, it goes back to the Russian Revolution, which even Stalin, he knew about it, of course, but he just couldn't figure out what was happening in Stalingrad. I'll tell you how it got its name. And Stalin didn't do anything to any note at all to get his name on that city. Um, what was there in Stalingrad was a sense of what we fight for: freedom, democracy, fraternity. It burned in the people that were there until they defeated the Germans. When they did that, Stalin's people came in and regained control over that group before they could create the kind of freedom that they wanted. Yeah. hmm Very few Russian staff, general staff people there. They were far from the city, far from the city. And what was rekindled in Stalingrad over those 6 months was the belief in what they were fighting for in 1917. They wanted to more of the moral renewal of their party. hmm And who's there are commissars, the folks that promote ideology. They're the ones that manage to rally the civilians and the lower echelon military fighting there to continue. And how did they do that? Okay. If you know anything about the Communist Party, it started in 1917. Um, very few people belonged to it. When it collapsed under Gorbachev, only 4% of the people in the Soviet Union belonged to the Communist Party. All right. The commissars, if you killed Germans in battle, you now could be a member of the Communist Party. It was closed. Now it was open. Okay. And what happened is that in Stalingrad, there were people soldiers that were recruited um, into units from um, the same region. Germany did the same thing. She recruited soldiers into units from the same region. Okay. Wow. And so, why is this important? Because the Germans tried the same thing after Stalingrad. Okay. They decided to bring many of their junior officers and soldiers and civilians into the National Socialist Party. But for some reason, it didn't work because the people didn't want, the German people didn't want to belong to the National Socialist Party. They even created what was called the National Socialist Leadership Office after Stalingrad. Hitler created that in order to see if he could, he knew why they lost at Stalingrad. That's right. He knew that. Okay. And so what was created at Stalingrad was the world's first political army, words and weapons, guns and books, alongside the hammer and sickle. Every thought, every action had political significance, and therefore the larger introduction of political surveillance, of which they borrowed from the Germans. And so there's these things that are happening at Stalingrad. Uh, Boy, they're important. All right. Now, but what about the name? Until 1925, it was called the City on the Yellow River, Tsaritsa, located on the Volga. There's a rail line, right? Caucasus not too far away, a transportation hub to southern Russia, weapons factory in World War One, largest munitions factory in Europe, 1914 forward. They were producing tanks, and I've got all the stories, but I could do a course on Stalingrad because there's so many that died there, and there was so much unique activity for the future of the Soviet Union that came out of this battle, along with Moscow. Is that when they were producing the tanks, the factory was such when you'd open up the door and go out, there was just this little area where the tank had to turn left or right. And on the other side of the river, the Germans would zero in on it. So before they opened the doors to put the tank out, they put the tank crew in there, and the tank came out actually firing across the river and turning. And the Russians were singing and screaming, hoping the tank could turn left or right before the Germans could hit it. And when the Germans hit it, they were singing and cheering on the other side of the river. And then the Russians would have to go out with vehicles and push the tank into the river because it was destroyed, and they had to get the next one out. That's how bad it was. Wow. And so in the middle of 1918, Lenin gave in to Stalin, who was a commissar, that they needed to do something against these white Russians that were the czarists that were around this city, this city on the Yellow River. And so uh, Stalin didn't mean anything to him. And so he went down there, and what did he find? He found a whole series of Russian generals who were still generals. They were generals for the Tsar. Now they're generals. They still had their old uniforms on. And he came down there, and they basically, he just tagged along with that area, and he told Lenin, all right, I'll shut Stalin up. Go down there as a commissar and see what you can do. And the old line Tsarist generals defeated the whites, which they should have been on that side, but they sided with the Red Army like that. And the story goes is that Stalin then decided to say, "Well, I saved the city." And 5 years later, in 1930, there's this cult of Stalin. He did very little to save the city. He's Joseph Goebbels 5 times over as a self promoter. Goebbels in Germany, Stalin by 1930 is a self promoter that he saved Stalingrad. He didn't do anything to save Stalingrad. Right. No, no, not at all. Therefore, in December of 1941, the Central Committee shortened the administrative criteria to be a member of the party. So admissions to the party to 3 months. Okay. And what you had to do is to get into the party, and this is where it's going to happen at Stalingrad. You had to kill a German, shoot down a plane, or take out a Panzer. Okay. And what this is called, and it doesn't come out, but it's really the detailed part of it. But detailed history is what we're really after. Um, what the Russians put together at Stalingrad is called a vengeance account. Number of opponents killed, weapons destroyed. If you had an empty account, no way you're getting into the party. Mm-mm, not at all. You got to fill it up. And that really took off in Stalingrad, and the idea that the commissars were there, dressed up in their leather jackets with one red star on their hat and maybe on their jacket, and the Germans picked them off with snipers. They were there to encourage them that the freedoms that you wanted in 1917 are here today. You just have to take them. And that's one of the key reasons why many of us actually believe and think that they weren't fighting for Joseph Stalin and Stalingrad. No, no, that's everybody. Stalin City, um, not the case. And I've got most translated personal accounts of these Russian historians who actually went in there and interviewed hundreds of people, every, from civilians to soldiers to children that were 10 and 12, all the way up to, citizens. The whole place is just literally destroyed. They're living in the ground. And they interviewed the military on the outside, other junior officers, is what was going on. And from that, you get this theme that comes out of it as to what they were fighting for. And you can really see it. And there's no reason for them to lie after the battle's over and the Germans were taken and trapped. And there's a process of how they got trapped in the salient. It tells us a lot as to what they were fighting for. And the Soviets to this day don't like to talk about that, but they can't take back the interviews. A lot of that came out when Gorbachev decided that things were going to change. All right, so that's a way of background. So let's go into it in a little bit of a detail today, and then if you have any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer those as well. Stalingrad, September 12th, 1942 to February 43. What's happening? Germans wanted control of the railroad, the river, and the industrial resources. That's the goal. Okay. And if the Russians lose control of that, that's going to cause a greater turmoil for them because as of 1914, it was always a czarist munitions facility, and they need it. And so, the military looks at it, and the Russians are basically got a big part of the city. They're just ready to pounce on the rest of it. And then what comes to the forefront is this idea that this is what we're fighting for. And that starts to spread. And when it spreads, the military, the Russian leaders back off from it and pull outside the city a good number of miles back, trying to get Zhukov and the rest of the Russian armies out of the Russian Far East so that they could, basically outflank and trap um, Paulus and his entire 300,000. So what it is, it's like a long football field. Is that, they got to go 50 to 75 miles beyond where the Germans are in order to catch them in this big loop, which is going to be called, a salient or a pocket. And the Germans should have been aware of that, but they weren't. Uh, yeah, I'll go back. These are what the textbooks tell us. About 6 months, September 12th, 42, February 43. Okay, that's what we got going on. Okay. All right, so we know that's going on. And there's this idea of the military pulling back, the high command waiting for Zhukov and the real professional army that's out in the Far East guarding against the Japanese. So we know, after Pearl Harbor and when you get into 42, things are going to change a little bit. So Stalin's going to bring those armies in, and in the meantime, the commissars are going to go in and they're going to get the people so that they will fight till the end, to the last breath. And that's what a lot of them put into their when they're writing. They're taking down a transcript of what these interviews are, and that kept the Germans occupied when they should have been able to take all of the city, and they couldn't realize why they couldn't do it. Well, it was actually men versus metal, and it was the Russian viewpoint of these soldiers, men, women, children, everybody fighting, is that this is ours. We're not going to give it to them, and we're going to get something out of it. We're going to go back to what the Russian Revolution was all about. They were getting pumped up with all that propaganda and all those things that Lenin said, peace, land, and bread, and all they got was blood, lead, and tears. Now they think they're going to get peace, land, and bread again. That didn't happen either, because Stalin's forces came in afterwards, and the whole process begins to change back. And so that's what we have. Now, here, uh, by September 42, the Germans controlled a large part of the city. This almost correlates then to these commissars coming in, meeting with individual groups about why we're here and why we're fighting. You see, that's what we're talking about. September 22nd, 1942. The Germans control a large part of the city. They just feel that they can just move through and take the rest of it. And what they end up moving against is putting in Russian metal, which is their tanks and all their armaments and everything they have, against the Russian people, the civilians, plus these other military units that are there that are more regional from the area. They're not an army that was collected from throughout the Soviet Union. These are regional people, and they know the streets and they know where their supplies are, and so they're really moving on this here. General Halder is replaced, and the German Sixth Army is trapped. Okay, and what happens is Hermann Hermann Goering, the flying circus. He was in World War One. The Luftwaffe. We can resupply them. Big mistake. Luftwaffe is now supplying both North Africa and Stalingrad. All right, and when the weather is really good, um, they're sending all the supplies into the German army. And then when the weather gets bad, the planes head off and try to take care of North Africa. Obviously, there's not enough. And so when the Luftwaffe is not in North Africa, Mussolini makes a mistake of sending ships in North Africa, and we sink all of them. And he's just flabbergasted that that happened. He wants help, and German air power can't do it. He can get a lot of the sulfur and things he needs for munitions from Corsica and Sardinia, which are used for all the gunpowder production, the right kind of minerals, but he can't get enough oil in because Germany can't get enough oil to him. That's why they wanted to get into Russia to get the Caucasus and the Baku oil fields and all of that. And so now the Luftwaffe can't do it. And when things really get tough in the winter, they bring in older planes and they can't resupply them. They can't get the parts in, and the winter's bad. They they needed to take certain things in 6 weeks. They couldn't take it in 6 weeks, and now they're stuck. They don't have enough food. They're literally freezing. The parts are breaking because it's so cold. But yet the German mechanics managed to piece enough of it together that they can still put up a good fight. Okay. Von Manstein is unable to rescue Paulus. It's one of the greatest, I think, struggles in the war. He comes near the end of the pocket. Just think, if the huge pocket is the length of like a football field, and right at the back goalpost out of the stadium, they're trying to break in, and they say 10 miles, but it's less than 10. So it, it could be 7.5. They come within 7.5, 8 miles, and Monstein puts in some of his. You wouldn't want to see the best German soldiers that could be found, fighters, um, were put in here to break through to rescue that. And who are they up against? Well, they're up against people that, not the citizens army, and not the group that was in Stalingrad. These are folks that come out of the Russian Far East. They're they're prized Russian soldiers, and I still don't know enough about all of them, but they fought the Germans to a standstill, about 7 miles, trying to rescue Paulus's to get to open up a protective, to drain them out. It's what they did at when we get back to Europe and a little more Western Europe. They did it at the Felice Pocket, and Patton wanted to close them, but Eisenhower said it was too dangerous, and Montgomery said, "Oh no, you couldn't do it." So the whole army escaped to fight again. Some of them were captured. Same thing they did at Sicily. The Germans were really good at draining pockets, except in World War One. They couldn't do it. Pershing beat them at one of the salients. They didn't. He took the salient, even though they drained the bulk of it. You see, they're good at it, but here they couldn't do it, and they couldn't set up a small corridor, of maybe a mile wide, a half mile wide, to get everybody out, and then put up these huge barriers of military hardware in there and to get the soldiers out and get them to safe lines. And there must have been, I think, some of the fiercest fighting you'd ever see was here to get them out, and they couldn't get them out. They couldn't. And Paulus surrenders. Hitler promoted him to a field marshal, several days before, thinking that would spur them on. And the idea you're supposed to not surrender, fight to the last. But he ended up, and they marched off to prisoner of war camps, which are basically death camps. 5 years after the war, they still wouldn't release them, the Russians. Brutal. The Italian Eighth Army is destroyed. Mussolini sent a huge number of troops, somewhere in the neighborhood of probably over 300,000 of the best Italian troops were there, and they were destroyed fighting as well. There's all these stories how the Italians and the others didn't get along in North Africa. Well, we know that there's some of that, and probably more in North Africa than here, but you won't find a whole lot written about what the Germans and the Italians are doing on the what they call the Russian front or the Eastern front. But the whole Italian Eighth Army was basically destroyed by the Russians like that. This battle claimed more lives than any other single conflict in the entire war. This is it. This is the battle. And for years it was said this is the turning point of the war. And I would agree to that to an extent. Moscow is going to be the same because Stalin decided that he wasn't going to abandon Moscow. I think it would have been a big, uh, the morale, I think, would have totally gone out of the bulk of the Soviet Union if Comrade Stalin um, fled to the Far East and tried to set up a station out there with support from us. And of course, we gave him the planes. He he had the planes and the runways outside of Moscow, and the planes were all ready to go, fighter escorts, everything to get him out because Moscow was collapsing, and he decided not to, and they held it. That's another one, but if we have time, I'll get into that. Okay. 1.3 million Russian soldiers died at Stalingrad. These are worse than, you know what? World War One. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. What did it produce? First major Soviet victory in the war. And they won't tell you, but the people that were fighting there were fighting for democracy and freedom. That's what the commissars were telling them. Mm-hmm. If they didn't tell them, didn't put them along that way, I believe the Germans agreed to it. Years after the war, the Germans, they knew what was happening. They knew what they were up against because they knew they weren't the fighters. They were wondering where those armies were, and their intelligence was a little faulty, and the winter, and they couldn't see, and all these things happening, and they just, you know, Paulus, a brilliant German officer, but he's got a lot of things against him, and communication wise, and food and resources. You got to make a lot of decisions each day. But the things that are happening are those are the kinds of things that are we believe going on. At least it's something to think about as a way to justify what was going on and why the Soviets were winning here. Before that, they weren't winning at all. They were the Germans were pushing them, mopping them up, hundreds of prisoners, thousands of prisoners, picking them up because they just kept losing, falling back, falling back. Well, what happened at Stalingrad? They sent in the commissars with the propaganda. Well, at least that's maybe the commissars believed it. Maybe they were stunned. I can't give you the names of the commissars. I've looked for those. Who are they? What happened to them after the war? But there's enough of the eyewitness accounts as to why they were doing this, and they didn't make it up. And boy, when they went in to see what was left of Stalingrad, you couldn't believe it. Uh, there was one street in there, and I don't have time to go into all of it, but I'll give you that. The Germans came up from. It's like a long street, like this main street in Stalingrad, and on the other side came up the Russians, and it's sort of like the shootout at the OK Corral, but there's like three or four, 500 on each side of it, and they just came up to
Oh
the center of
God.
the street, and when they ran out of ammunition, they were fighting each other with their rifles, with bayonets, knives. Just it's like when you read, and I read that account, and I thought this is unreal. This couldn't have happened, but people were watching it, and they recorded it. It's burned into their minds. I thought, and this is the kind of fighting that was taking place here. Well, what motivates people to do that? All right. The Germans lost the initiative on the Eastern Front. And so they lost part of it from the ideological point of view, but it was a skewed ideology that went back to why they fought in the beginning in 1917, why the Russian Revolution started, and what they wanted. And it's those kinds of people sitting there in an old Tsarist city that believed, they wanted these things and they hadn't been getting them, but now they're going to get them because the commissars are there, if that's the case. That's just one explanation. So the question is, you can read all around this, but it'll never give you the answers to, gee, how come Stalingrad did so well here? Well, it was, of course, the Zhukov and the army saved him. That's only part of it. Russia's future hung in the balance at three major cities: Moscow, Stalingrad, Leningrad. Okay, they knew that, and they're going to get each one. They're going to get each one, right? And they're going to start with Stalingrad, and they're going to move from there to Moscow. Um, and you can see these. Yeah. And Stalin, he knew that he didn't do much to get his name on it. He just took it because he propped himself up as, I saved this city, from the so-called white Russians that were there. And he was a commissar. He just made it up as he went along. But the people there believed in that, and now they were back. Their ancestors had told them they're back to claim these freedoms. German miscalculation. Okay, and this is what the cities did. They basically drained the the German army, and this is it's a basic miscalculation that you see that takes place in history, attacking cities instead of armies. What did we do? We we circled around the cities with our military and went on. Eisenhower told the troops, and you won't, it's not in our book, and maybe it should be, but I've spent enough time and I see it over and over. We look through these documents. Eisenhower told the troops, stay out of those cities, stay out of those towns. We don't have enough food. We can't feed our own troops, and we're fighting um, armies, not cities. And so when you see those Americans handing out candy and everything like that in front of the troops in all of these movies, boy, is that a misnomer. They hardly had any of that. No matter what they tell you, the totals don't add up unless somebody just shipped them over there and they never had any record of all these chocolate bars and all this food. Our troops just didn't have enough food when we were fighting in Europe. We needed a lot more. We didn't have all those chocolate bars and all those other things that were there. Eisenhower told his generals, Pat and the rest of them, stay out of the cities. We can't feed those people. We can barely feed our own. We're chasing armies. We're not liberating the cities. It's okay to march in and have some parades and things like that, but we can't feed it. We can't feed these people. It's like,
So
oh, they have all this food. No, no, they don't.
when you're
Okay.
watching these movies and stuff, was there actually that amount of urban warfare, or would they have been more in the fields?
Well, in Russia, it's urban warfare,
Right.
and
I mean, like in my mind's eye, I'm thinking like Saving Private Ryan or something, like after the beach scene.
yeah, that they needed to bypass all of that. I mean, our goal is to chase down the German armies and destroy the means of um, their ability to
The
fight.
actual
We're
threat.
out to do that. And we're chasing a German army. If they happen to hold up in the cities, we can do some things there. Just like Bastogne, when we get trapped there, and really not trapped, but we get out of that. And so the Germans spend most of their time using their resources surrounding cities, which is hard because you got street to street fighting. Uh, Same thing. It's another comparison to the Pacific. We don't have time to get there. Maybe I'll get there in a couple of weeks when we shift over there. But German strategy of taking those three cities, it's the same mistake that Napoleon made. In warfare, you want to go after armies, just like in the Civil War. Lee's out to destroy the Army of the Potomac. Grant's out to destroy the Army of Northern Virginia. You know, we'll get Richmond and Washington later. We got to destroy these armies. That's their means to fight. And so the Germans use up that. They made the same mistake in World War One, tearing up all those Belgian cities and those Belgian forts when there's no need to do that. Forts don't move. Cities don't move. Surround them, cut them off, and move on. I mean, school children could figure that out, right? At the end of 1941, there's 3 million Russian prisoners and 1.5 million dead. What does that tell you? Like, whoa. Yeah, 3 million at the end of 41. Pearl Harbor is December 7th, 41. What have the Russians lost already? Now, half of those prisoners are going to die. That's a conservative number. Germany is after the oil reserves at Baku. She doesn't have enough oil. The Greater Reich isn't quite the Greater Reich. She needs those resources. She's got the Austro-Hungarian parts of that old empire set up. She needs resources. She's going to get food resources out of the southern part of France, out of Vichy, France. She'll get some things out of Poland as well, but she needs the raw materials to do that. Okay. August, right here, 1941. The 6th German Army had half the city. The question is, why couldn't she get the other half? Right? Yeah. October 1941, Paulus launches a major offensive against the Russians. Right? Yeah. Holding out at the tractor factory, which Henry Ford is probably responsible for, because after World War One, we and Lenin gets all set up. We got people. Lenin is smart because we kind of help them a little bit, but we can't do it officially because we don't recognize them. But other people go over there so that they learn how to make tractors, because they didn't even know how to put together a transmission so things could work in reverse. But when the time comes, these Russians are going to produce, one of the greatest tanks in the world, which is the T-34, and we will see the T-34 in Korea. And until we get our bigger tanks over there, they just literally run through our smaller tanks that we had in Korea. But when we bring over the big boys, we take on those T-34s and just tear them apart. But we're not there yet. You see, that's another war. So the Russians are holding on to that tractor factory, and those are those local workers and producers that are there. And this is where this fervor comes of, like, you know, this tractor factory is producing tanks. Um, it may have been one of the tractor factories that produced tanks uh, as Hitler began to rearm. But the Russians give us no information about that. You can't find out exactly. They say, oh, no, we didn't produce anything. And it's like, come on, planes, things like that. Where were they produced? Anyway, this is what's happening. So Paulus has got to knock this out because that's supplying these tanks. Russian General Chukov uh, held no land across the Volga, didn't hold any. The Germans had it all. What was going on here? What's going on? Okay, the Russians had special squads that shot deserters. Okay, right. Okay, so if you do, those are the military aspect of it, but you also got to realize about the civilian, all those, the production, and remember, this is an industrial city until it's destroyed, and then they'll rebuild it. Those people, you know what? If those civilians were scared, they would have run away, right? Yeah, the Germans are coming. Let's get out of here. Those aren't the military doing all this work. You know who the deserters are. Those are the military. They're not the people who live there. There might have been a few, but if you know the Germans are coming and they're, across the river, why would you stay? You see, there's something that's motivating them. And I believe this is the ideology of the war. This is where you see it. You see communism and fascism square right there. And across the river, the Germans had some, but I haven't been able to find anything where there's been a whole lot of National Socialist propaganda that's running through, the German Sixth Army. If you find it, let me know. So I can't say if it was there or it wasn't, but I know it was on the Russian side. Oh yeah, yeah. Somebody made that strategic point to get those commissars in there, and I think that's made the difference here. Germans unable to get them out. They can't get them out. So they called in reinforcements from the north and the south. That's another strategic miscalculation. What you want to do is just, I mean, they could have pulled out. What's the likelihood that those folks in Stalingrad could have chased down the German Sixth Army until Zhukov? And I think Stalin brings either six or seven armies out of the Russian Far East because that's where he was going to go. So he has been building it up, of course, to protect his regime and all of his people. He's going to be surrounded by his armies out there, knowing that he makes that decision, which is kind of a spur of the moment because he was already on the train. I'd like to do that story for you before we uh, do this. But let me move ahead. Stalin's plan flanked north and south, right? That's what he wants to do. He's going to go far to the north and far to the south. That's part of Zhukov because it's held by Italians and Romanians, and the Russians think they can get by them and then encircle Paulus, and that's what they're going to do. Okay. So on November 23rd, the Sixth Army, 250,000 men, they had to get out or they're going to be encircled, and the Russian armies coming from the Far East are going to crush them. But it's more like I gave you a conservative number here. It's 300,000 men. It's even more. Very few of them ever get back to Germany after they surrendered. I don't know what happened to them like that. Temperature 30 below. Yeah. Germans bread rations cut from 100 grams to 50 grams. Now they're weak. That may be a key as to why when von Manstein brought in those Germans to open that gate up to get them out of there, I'm surprised that he didn't give them. Russians had just like the Germans had this, just like they did during the Roman legion period. They had what were called, these war rations for special duty like this. That for 2-3 weeks you'd be eating all of this, lots on meat, rabbit, a lot of they get all this meat and protein and cheese and everything into these men and get them out there. Now, I know they were doing that in other battles, but I don't know if the Germans did it to get them to try to save Paulus. Uh, because the troops they had there, if you look at who they were and where they came from, it's like they should have been able to brush those Russians away. So what leads me to believe is that if the Germans there at Stalingrad with Paulus, those 250,000 plus 300,000 were just getting 50 grams of bread and maybe some frozen jam and not a whole lot of water and everything else they needed. Maybe when those German troops got there, there's these high-powered fighters, the best of the best. They might have been exhausted if they came in by a plane or truck or wherever they got in there, and maybe they didn't have enough food. Maybe they were disorganized. Maybe they were tired. Who knows? Cold, whatever it is, it didn't work. So we know that because we have documentation. They didn't have enough food. Food, big problem if you don't have it. Hitler refused to order them to withdraw, and he basically condemned them. They had that one window of a few days when the Russians cut it off, and boy, when they cut it off, there was no way to get out of it. The Russians held strong with that. So Zhukov's people, well trained, organized. Van Manstein in December tried to relieve him, and he's the one that set up the plan that break through and cut France in half. He knew what he was doing. He's a brilliant officer, and they couldn't do it, which tells me after this battle, I said, watch out. The Russian steamroller's coming. And Stalin rewarded those people at Stalingrad, and now it makes a lot more sense to me because in the last 2 weeks I've been really, working on this question again, because he told the people at Stalingrad that they started the Russian steamroller of 1917, And those people went wild, cheering, thinking, yes, it's going to be all these things that Lenin told us about. Well, Russian steamroller got to Berlin, but they didn't get the freedoms and things that they thought they would get. He saw to that. Paul has tried to break out even. He's coordinating with them. Soviet Marshal Moskovsky demanded they surrender on January 3rd, 1943. Hitler told Paulus surrender is forbidden, so they're still communicating back and forth like that. January 10th, the Soviets then begin the offensive. That's when they let people into Stalingrad. They know that they think they've got the Germans now, so now they can push. This is when it really begins. Last 10 days, it lasted 10 days. They took the German airfields. When the German airfields couldn't be defended, the whole salient, this long, drawn out protective corridor that Paulus had is getting smaller and smaller. Then the Russians cut it in half and they begin to round them up, and he has no choice, but he's got to surrender. January 31st, 43, Hitler promoted Paulus to field marshal, thinking he would fight on, and field marshals are always victorious. That didn't happen. And then he reminded him the field marshals don't surrender. They tried to trade for him, and Stalin he said, I'm not going to, don't give me all these cheap, that's a Russian translation, cheap uh, Russian officers, like we would call them lieutenants or captains like that for a German general. Yeah, so he wasn't going to let him go no matter who they gave him. He didn't care. February 2nd, 1943, 1,000 miles from home, Paulus surrendered the 6th German Army, and I think it's closer to 300,000. For 3 days, the German state radio played solemn music. Everybody across the world wanted to know the results of Stalingrad. Just like there's some event you want to listen to on the radio or some special game or something, boy, everybody's tuned into it. Because here, the war could go either way. This is one great battle. It's just like the rules of war. Whoever wins it, they're going to be it. That's going to be it. 110,000 German soldiers became prisoners, probably more than that, but these are the conservative numbers that we have. 800,000 German soldiers died, almost a million. This is what we know. Wow. Yeah. Yep. In 2 years, the Reich is in severe difficulty by that fateful decision. And I gave you as one of the greatest decisions in really, 20th century decision to invade the Soviet Union, their Kessel. That's it. The valley, the, the pocket, the trap. Uh-huh. Indication of German mutinies. Germans don't like to talk about it much. Neither does the German High Command. But after that, there's mutinies like that take place. Wow. German mutinies. Mm-hmm. Germans called the city the Rattenkrieg. Yeah. Zhukov ordered hand-to-hand combat, and that's what they did. Paulus was a World War I captain. He was at Verdun. At Stalingrad, he was in the largest clash of arms the world had ever seen. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was there. And what happened is before the last planes were out, Paulus, through his officers, gave the German soldiers some paper, pencils, all that. They told them to write some letters home to their family. And they did. There were hundreds and hundreds of these letters. Okay. We know that some of them got through, and they ended up in Berlin. And then Hitler had the letters opened up and read, and then they were instructed to write letters like, we'll be home soon, we're beating these Russians, and those got delivered. Some of the last planes at the airfield that I just described to you were captured. When they were, the Russians got a hold of the letters. And in the last 20 to 25 years, they published, I think, about 700 of them, of which the Germans immediately said those was Russian propaganda. Our soldiers would never write letters like that. And this is after the war. And I have some of those, and the few that I've read, and I'm out of time here for today, but the few that I've read, it's like we're finished, we're beaten. Why did we invade? What is this war? Yeah. hmm Most of them, everyone. I didn't, have a number of them, and I only read a few of them. They're pretty bad letters in the sense that they're all saying this is. If you ever get this, by the time you get this letter, I'll be dead. They're saying, and this is why did we ever get into this? He's a madman, and all these rest of those things like that. I can't tell you whether the Russians wrote them or the Germans wrote them. Who knows? But they're there. But we do know that the Germans rewrote those letters because German families after the war brought those forward. And you can find them if you look. And then the ones that were original got through, they burned, I'm sure. They destroyed them like that. Okay, we'll have to wait next week. Okay. I missed that. I'll have to let me see uh, the movie. There were snipers at Stalingrad on both sides. I don't know how accurate that is. I've read a little of the transcript, but he was a real person that's in there. I can't remember his name, but he actually had one of those vengeance cards and he got into the Communist Party. I read that yesterday. I was going through the letters, and he's in that book of these published letters. He being interviewed. He was interviewed at Stalingrad after this was there, and whatever happened to him, he had a card. He got into the Communist Party because of the number of kills that he had. Robert, go ahead.
Yeah, you kind of answered part of that question, but it seemed like there was a lot of women snipers that were involved in the Russian offensive.
Absolutely. Yes, there's pictures of them. And then when the Germans caught him, it was terrible. No reason to go into it. You can read it, but this is uh, this is the battle. Yeah, this is the battle. Yes, total warfare. Absolutely. Children as well, 12, 11, 12, 13, passing information. Uh, it's very complex. I tried to give you a little insight into it today. So yeah, that movie is an interesting one. Enemy at the gate. Wow, tough, tough scenario all the way around like that. We need to know more. I try to, I have a lot more on it, but we just didn't have the time for today to get into that. I wanted to give you an overview as to why it's set up as one of the cataclysmic battles that may be the turning point because of the victory that everybody needed, and the Russian Stalin said that we all earned it, and his role in it. I mean, where he was and what was going on. It's Zhukov coming in and coordinating with these political commissars, I think, is a large part of it. But all of that's yet to be determined. I can only give you a little window into it at this point. And have copies of the letters and the interviews that came out. Most people don't even know about the interviews, let alone use them, because Stalin wanted to know. He and historians, objective people. It's amazing that he did it, but he didn't know. He wanted to know how it happened, and when he found out about it, he determined, well, we're not going to let that stuff get around. So he sent in other people to correct all these ideas about what was going to happen, and then they deported a lot of the people, I believe, and put them into work camps so that they would calm down and be nice followers of whatever he wanted to do. That's what we think happened, but I don't have a lot of additional evidence on it. All right, folks. Thanks very much. I try to get in